Hi everybody, I'm just some guy, and today I'm going to review the comic book Judas. Oh boy, spectacles, testicles, wallets, and watch. We're about to talk about religion. I first heard about this book from Underground Geek's video. I'll link to it below. He reviewed the first issue, and that made me want to go and check out the comic. Full disclosure, I'm an atheist, so anything that questions religion will usually pique my interest. Religion is always a touchy subject matter for fiction. Whether it's the hardcore believer or the adamant atheist, there's bound to be something that offends someone. There's really no way to avoid this, although I do think there are some ways to ease it. The problem is that when you do that, you can't really get into the meat of any analysis. In order to dig into the lore and tell a story, whatever that may be, you're going to need to play around with the concepts, and someone's going to be salty about that. Judas is a comic that brings the salt. From Boom Studios' website, quote, Judas Iscariot journeys through life and death, grappling with his place in the greatest story ever told, and how much of his part was preordained. In a religion built on redemption and forgiveness, one man has to sacrifice himself for everyone, and it wasn't Jesus. You can just hear the booty holes puckering up. But it's a fair question when it comes to Judas's role in the Jesus narrative. Depending on your version of Christianity, Judas was destined to betray Jesus. In the Gospels, at least some of them, it makes it clear that Jesus knew someone would betray him and knew who it was. That begs lots of questions, and that's what this comic book is about. It's written by the perfectly named Jeff Loveness, and the art is by Jacob Rebelka. The art for the book is gorgeous. Rebelka gives the art a kind of storybook look with rich colors and a pastel coloring style. I really enjoyed the colors because it gave the book a more traditional feel. He also uses color to tell the story. The color scheme changes as the tension rises and falls. What I found really interesting was his color choice for hell. You'd think he'd go for reds and oranges, since hell is usually associated with fire. Instead, Rebelka chooses to use blues, keeping the tones muted and dark. This changes the feel of hell of something from physical to psychological torment. It's cold, distant, and desolate. The scenes reek of loneliness and separation, which works perfectly for the story. I also like that Rebelka chose to depict all the biblical figures as having brown skin. I think we're at a point now that we can admit that none of these people, if they were real, were white. They're Middle Eastern and they should look like it. I also enjoyed his use of biblical imagery, especially the black halo around Judas's head. Rebelka definitely takes liberties. There are creatures that are described in quoted scriptures, and when you look at the art, they don't look anything like what the text says. But that's not a problem because they still look creepy and demonic, and that's really what matters. Another element I love about Rebelka's work is that you can more or less follow the story visually. That's a key factor for me. You can look at the page and get exactly what's going on, even in complex scenes where the dialogue and captions explain what you're seeing. The art alone would make me love this book, but John Loveness's story completely sold me. The premise of the story is simple. If Judas was destined to betray Jesus, if he was born to do this, how was it his fault? As Loveness explains in an interview, quote, growing up, I always felt sorry for Judas. He was always portrayed as a villain and the epitome of betrayal, but the entire Christian narrative of redemption and forgiveness hinges on him. He was born and destined to play this part in that story. There was never a chance for him to be anything else. I can already hear the people, but. The problem is, Loveness has a point. The central theme with Judas is that he betrays Jesus for money, which he later regrets and throws away, and depending on the gospel, kills himself out of guilt. The issue here is that if Judas was destined to do this, he had no control over his actions, and therefore had no real reason to feel guilt. More importantly, his act isn't betrayal. It was meant to happen. Imagine the effect that would have on a person knowing they did this horrible thing to someone they cared about, and then realizing that it was all preordained, a setup in effect, and that the person they hurt was in on it. This is where the story opens up, with Judas asking as he hangs himself, quote, did you know it would be me? From the beginning? Did you know all of it? Was that why you chose me? Was that the only reason you chose me? I tried so hard to believe, to be good, but you knew. From the beginning, I never had a chance. It's a powerful opening because it cuts to the core of one of the central tenets and problems with Christianity. The idea that God, and therefore Jesus, knows everything that will happen, including every choice you will make. The best breakdown of this problem I've ever heard comes from The Matrix Reloaded. Neo finally gets to meet the Oracle again, and she offers him a piece of candy, and Neo says, do you know if I'm going to take it? And the Oracle says, I wouldn't be much of an Oracle if I didn't. But if you already know I'm going to take it, how can I make a choice? Because you didn't come here to make the choice. You've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it. Thought you would have figured that out by now. Neo's question hits at the core of Judas's conflict in the story. If he has free will, there's no way anyone, including God, should know what choice you can make. If your choices can be known before you make them, then you're not really choosing. You're basically playing out a preordained program. Where it gets nasty is that Christianity adds in an extra element. God made everything too. If that's true, then every choice you make is not only something that God knows before you do it, but something He specifically made you to do. That's exactly what Judas realizes. He goes through the tragedies of his life, losing his mother, having to steal, and decides that the world doesn't want him. Then one day he hears a voice, and it said, "Come, follow me." Follow is the least of the things I do for you, Jesus, with that sexy hair and them eyes. So Judas follows Jesus and eventually hears another voice. He ignores it until one day he listens and sees a flaw in what Jesus is doing. Judas says, "I could not look at you the same way, because if you could do all these things, if you had this power, if it was this easy for you, why was life this way? If you could heal the sick, why is the world so full of suffering? If you could feed the hungry, why does the world starve? If you could walk on water, why make a world where men drown? If you could conquer death, why does she die alone?" These are all questions I think any believer and non-believer asks, and if we're honest, they're all questions that can't be answered, at least not in any way that sounds remotely logical. Loveness doesn't try to answer the questions. Instead, he lets Judas play out like a normal person would. He resents what's been done to him. As he wanders hell, he suddenly recognizes an attack. This is where Loveness plays with the biblical lore by citing Isaiah 53, verses 3 through 4. These verses are often thought by Christians to refer to the suffering Christ. They're actually a reference to Israel. Loveness applies it to Judas as he's being attacked, and just like before, Judas hears a voice saying, "Come, follow me," and you know who it is. This is where the story gets meaty and Loveness world builds. Lucifer explains to Judas that God has written this story for this world, this all-encompassing idea of how things will play out, except the story is broken. This broken element falls down to choice. Lucifer lists 4 examples: Pharaoh, Goliath, Jezebel, and Lot's wife. All 4 of them were punished by God in some way, but all of them also share a punishment primarily because God's story needs villains. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. This is why he refuses to let the Hebrews leave. Then God sends his plagues, and Pharaoh relents. But then God steps in and again hardens Pharaoh's heart. He's then killed for essentially doing what God made him do. The same applies to Goliath. It's as if he's there just to be a foil for David. Jezebel is a trickier one, and I didn't think a good pick because Lucifer argues in the story that her ambition and the idea that she didn't need a god was why she was punished. It's not a strong one, but Lot's wife is a strong one. She's punished for doing what every normal person would do when running away from destruction. She turned and looked and was turned into salt. We don't even get her name. If you take these as nothing but stories, then there's not much of a problem. They're just morality plays. But if you take them as true, you start to hit on the problem again: choice. None of them could really choose to do anything different than what they did because their roles were already decided for them. The idea that they would be punished eternally for something they were supposed to do is totally immoral. That's basically the point here. I know, people aren't going to agree, but this is what Loveness is hitting on. I like that Loveness doesn't play Judas as unhinged or evil, but just a regular guy. So he's not buying Satan's take on things. He goes off and challenges this idea that Lucifer is innocent of the things he's done, specifically whispering things into people's ears to get them to do stuff. And Lucifer says, quote, "If that makes you feel better, that's what I'm here for, isn't it? I've been many things to many people. Whatever you can blame besides yourself. Whatever he tells you I am. Because he needs a villain. Because he's afraid of what I know." And what does he know? That it was a lie, full of empty sycophantic praise for a sadistic God who deserved none of it. He lays out that he rebelled because he wanted God to be more, to be better than this, but it turned out that even Lucifer's rebellion was part of the story. I know, I can feel the tension, but there's a valid point here, and Lucifer nails it. Quote, "Do I command you to kill in my name? To murder your sons? Do I demand constant praise? Do I force you to repress your very self? Do I send my children here, like him?" Here's a being who demands much of you, punishes you for failing to achieve the impossible, and then wants you to thank him for it, all while threatening you with eternal damnation. Worse, everything that exists, everything that happens, is because of this being. He doesn't just allow it to happen. He causes it to occur, and then has the unmitigated gall to become one of us to save us from the world he basically controls. Lucifer asks how Judas felt once he realized this and was with Jesus, and Judas says, like he was spitting in my face. And I think this is how many people who leave their faith, like Loveness, feel about it, because there's so much doctrine and dogma that people are taught that turns out to be complete nonsense. It's bound to piss you off. Loveness takes another turn in the story, though, by playing with the lore. There's this moment in the book of Mark where Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" For those of you who want to hear it in the original, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. In context, it definitely reads like he wasn't expecting to actually end up on a cross. Loveness takes this a step further. Jesus wasn't in on the entire plan. He lands in hell, and he's just as shocked as Judas. Judas confronts Jesus. I want you to make note of that. But before Jesus can respond, Lucifer starts monologuing. Jesus tries to shut him down, only to find he's lost his power. This is shown in a really cool way. Throughout the book, all of Jesus' words are shown in red. As he speaks in hell, the red drains away and becomes the usual black text. Now he's just a normal guy. And then Lucifer lays down another bit of truth, that Jesus had no idea what it meant, what it really meant to take on all the sins of the world. When it hits him, Jesus isn't prepared. He calls out to God, and Lucifer tells him that God isn't there and won't be. He left Jesus to fend for himself. At this point, Judas confronts Jesus again. But you keep that in mind. And Jesus admits that he knew from the beginning what would happen to Judas. Judas asks why Jesus didn't warn him, and Jesus says it was the only way. For the religious, this may seem like a powerful statement. For the non-believer, it may seem like a hollow statement. In context, it's the only answer Jesus can give because he honestly believes what he's saying. He genuinely believed this was the only way for salvation to happen. Before Judas can dig into that statement, the thief on the cross appears. If you know your Bible, then you know about the two men crucified with Jesus. One Jesus forgives, the other he doesn't. That guy ends up in hell and challenges Jesus. He says, I watched you grant salvation to the other thief on a whim because he begged you like a child. You knew nothing of his life, his crimes, what I saw him do. Yet you saved him and tortured me. Why? Well, for one, you didn't ask. I know that's flippant, but that's actually what it comes down to in Christianity. One man's sins are forgiven, no matter how horrible, because he asked for forgiveness, while the man who committed lesser wrongs gets punished regardless of how he feels about his actions. Guilt, shame, and regret are not the redeeming factors. Changing one's life isn't the redeeming factor. Only asking for forgiveness is. That's what Loveness is getting at, and that's because it's a major flaw in the system. Granted, there is the idea that if a person doesn't really mean it, they aren't forgiven. But there's also the implication that if a person is truly sorry but feels too ashamed or guilty to ask for forgiveness, they will be punished anyway. There's also the problem of what happens to people who don't believe, either because they accept another religion, don't follow any religion, or had the misfortune of being born before Jesus came to earth to save us all. Judas confronts Jesus a third time, and this isn't a mistake. Loveness is playing on Peter's denial of Jesus by having Jesus dance around answering Judas's questions outright. Jesus finally says yes, that he knew what would happen to Judas. And Judas says to him, then I was wrong. I didn't betray you. You betrayed me. It's such a powerful moment, but I couldn't focus on it because my eyes were locked on Judas's baby arm. Seriously, why is your arm so short? Are you hiding Quato under your robes? At this point, all the souls swarm Jesus, and Judas marvels because even in this peril, Jesus doesn't hate those attacking him. Judas realizes that even though Jesus knew Judas would betray him, he never hated Judas. So Judas begs the souls to stop, but Lucifer explains it's too late. Jesus says he'll rise in 3 days, but Lucifer claps back with, but you were a god then. Now you're only a man, and men die. And so Jesus is pulled deep into the bowels of hell. Lucifer is ready to revel in the broken story, the damaged plan of God, but Judas isn't having it. Not because he cares about the plan, but because he cares about Jesus and his message. So he dives into the bowels of hell to save Jesus. Now, Normally, I wouldn't give away the end of a story, but I think I need to just to unclench some of those puckered booty holes out there. When Judas reaches the bottom, all of hell tries to stop him from going deeper, but none of them will follow. Like Lucifer, even they dare not go further. Finally, Judas finds Jesus, practically crucified again. As Judas gets him down, Jesus says that he's seen everything, including the future, and how people will hurt and kill in his name. He's seen the suffering he will cause despite all his efforts, and he says, quote, "I wasn't enough. They cannot be saved." Lucifer was right. He was always right. The story is broken. That's an admission I don't think many of the faithful would like, but it's one people have to contend with considering all the cruelty and violence done in Jesus' name over the last 2,000 years. If he had this foreknowledge, surely something could have been done to prevent it. I think Loveness added this in because it's such a tricky issue for people coming out of religion to cope with. The sheer amount of suffering in the world, especially to the most helpless of us, children, is staggering. How could this be allowed to happen? Loveness then takes us for another spin. Judas thinks of the Abraham and Isaac story, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac to prove his love and devotion to God. Judas says, quote, "It always struck me as evil, a cruel test. But you weren't testing him. You were testing yourself. You were seeing if it could be done, if a father could truly give up his son, if you could send him here, to go where you could not, to endure all this, alone. But, oh God, you didn't want him to be alone." And there you go. The reason for Judas's betrayal wasn't for Jesus' mission on earth, but so that he wouldn't be alone in hell. It's meant to be a powerful switch, and it is. It's a total reshaping of the lore, but in a way that's more horrific, honestly. Instead of Judas being a pawn, he's just a board. He's there so Jesus will have someone at his side. But this means Judas still must suffer with no hope of salvation. That said, it does come across as less dickish than just making him the villain. Judas realizes his role and turns to Jesus and says, "Come, follow me." And he tries to lead Jesus out of hell. But there's a problem. See, only someone without sin can defeat death, and Jesus has sinned against Judas. So he asks, "Judas Iscariot, can you forgive me?" Before Judas can answer, Lucifer pops in to monologue again about the broken story. Judas concedes that the story is broken, but that he doesn't believe in the story. He believes in Jesus. Well, Lucifer isn't having that, and has the demon horde attack. They pull the pair apart, and finally Judas shouts, "Jesus, I forgive you." Then Jesus goes full on Bleach mode and ascends to heaven. Judas again sees the man whom he chose to follow all those years ago. And as Jesus leaves, he says to Judas, quote, "I will tell her, and she will say, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" Jesus rises, but Judas does not. He remains in hell, but he says, quote, "As I watch the story continue without me, beyond me, I remember your words, and I am comforted. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. But that's not how the story ends. It ends with Judas, black halo intact, wandering hell, doing Jesus' work. Instead of wallowing in anger and hate, he chooses love, and he says, quote, "When I do not know how, when I stumble, when I lose the words, I reach out and use yours. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now that's how you end a story. It's not the ending Christians might like, but it's the ending that feels most pure to the story and offers something oddly missing from the hell narrative: redemption. Again, religion is a tricky issue, and dealing with eternal suffering of hell is one I've never heard explained well. Loveness sidesteps this by offering a different idea. What if redemption can happen even if one remains in hell? It's a different kind of story, and I'm sure plenty of religious people might be turned off by it. I'd say give it a chance. It's well written, well drawn, and there's a good message in the story, even if it doesn't fit your faith. For non-believers, this isn't a hit piece. You can see that Loveness doesn't tear down religion so much as he tinkers with the concepts. Don't go into this thinking it's anti-religion, because it really isn't. By all means, I think people should check out this book. It's 4 issues miniseries. It's probably going to be bound into a trade pretty soon. If you get the chance, pick it up. Anyway, those are my thoughts. If you've read the series or an issue, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for listening.